Jane, why don't you give us your full name and when and where you were born?
Jane Eleanor Pierson. I was born in 1942 in New Jersey. I was born in Elizabeth, New Jersey, but I grew up in as near the shore, Belmar, Asbury Park, near the shore in New Jersey. It was a wonderful place to grow up, actually.
Tell us like what your life was like before you ever heard of the women's movement.
Well, growing up, I was a lower middle class family, and my mother worked, my dad worked, my mom worked, and we tried to, we kind of made ends meet. Um, it was a neighborhood that was kind of a lower middle class neighborhood. I went to school in a place called Manasquan, New Jersey, which was 5 miles away. I had to take a bus to go there. And uh, it was a very interesting place because it was known for its being a summer vacation kind of location. So in the winter, it was very quiet. But we had the beach to ourselves in the winter. So I grew up with this sense of connection to water and to the beach. And I was quite athletic, and would walk every day or run every day on the beach. So I was very fortunate. I had a very interesting time as I grew up. When I got ready to go to college, when I was finishing high school, I had to find a college where I could get a scholarship, and I had to find a college where I could also work because we didn't have funds for that. So I found a school in New York called, it was part of the State University of New York system. It's called FIT, Fashion Institute of Technology. I was very easily, I got in on a scholarship, and I was able to start working even before I started school. There were plenty of jobs, and they helped us get jobs too. I was not the only one in that school that needed to work. Most of us needed to work.
Uh-huh. And so were you conscious of women's role in your school and society?
Well, I was. My mother was a very independent person. And although she was a housewife to start with, she went out and got a job. But even when she was a housewife, she was head of the Girl Scouts, she was secretary of the school PTA. She was very involved in our church, which was an Episcopal church. And she stepped out in the community. She was not one of those people who worried about dust on the shelves. We cleaned the shelves, but it was not the top thing on her mind. But she was so independent um, that when I grew up, I thought that's what I want to be independent, like my mother is independent. And so from a very early age, that was one of the reasons I went to FIT, was that I thought I could work. I wasn't going to be stuck in some school where I couldn't work. And I wanted to be in New York because I thought there were lots, and the center of the world.
Right, right, right. And so when did you become aware of the women's movement and get involved?
I became aware of it when I was a reporter in South Bend, Indiana, working on a television station owned by Notre Dame University, which was an anti-woman kind of place. There were a few of us women who had professional jobs there. Most did not. They wouldn't let you join any of the clubs. You couldn't go to school there, etc. But I was a television reporter, and I remember I was sitting in my office, and Betty Friedan came on one of our monitors in the office, and I looked up and I thought, "Oh, who's she?" So I turned the sound up, and I immediately thought, "I'm going to work on that."
What year was that? Do you know?
I don't know, when was her book published? It is the year that her book was published, because she was being interviewed on either the Today Show or something like that. And I immediately got the book, and I immediately began to both read it and then talk about it with some of my women friends who were actually in graduate programs at Notre Dame. They did allow women to be in graduate programs, but not the rest of their programming. So we began to talk about, well, this is interesting. I then shortly, I was there for quite a while and went to Europe, came back. And when I got back to South Bend, I thought, I've got to do something more than this. And shortly thereafter, my husband got a job in Washington, D.C. I moved to Washington, and I probably wasn't here more than 3 months, 2 or 3 months, when the first caucus, National Women's Political Caucus meeting was held. I saw it on television, and I thought, that's for me. So I, as soon as I could track them down, I went in and volunteered to help. I was probably within a week of seeing it on television, right after the meeting.
And what did you do to help?
Oh, it's a volunteer, and the whole place was a little, there wasn't much structure, I would say. And so I did initially anything I could do, picking up papers, checking on this, checking on that, answering the telephones, because there were a lot of telephone calls. But I very quickly became what was called the field director, the organizing and field director. And at the time, Doris Meisner had been asked by one of the people who had gone to the first meeting, if she would come and because she had also just moved to Washington, if she would come and be the executive director. So she became the executive director. Doris and I liked each other a lot. In fact, we're still friends after all these years. And she asked me, well, do you want to be the field director? I said, well, sure, I'll do that. Because I had some experience with politics. I'd covered politics when I was a journalist. And, I had worked in a political campaign in New York City when I was in school. Not much, but I did. So I became the political director, and we spent our time trying to organize this flow of information that was coming in from all over the country. Women from every state were calling. It was astonishing. The letters that would come in asking if they could be part of the organization. So my job was to follow up with them and try to encourage them to start caucuses, tell them a little bit about what we were doing. And then I began to build lists of people in all the states, in the state organization. So, mainly talked on the phone and encouraged people to get involved, and then wrote letters to them and organized materials to send to them. We wrote all sorts of background material, and what did we know? The caucus was a brand new thing. And so we made an effort to make it a thing.
Okay,
It wasn't just an idea. It wasn't just an idea. We turned it into an organization, I guess I would say that.
What was the goal of the organization at the time?
To elect as many women as we could to political office. There were practically none elected to political office at the time. Bella Abzug was, Shirley Chisholm. There were a few that had been elected, but not very many. Mm-hmm. And our job was to work with those women who were already elected. Most of them were Democrats at the time. Not all. Margaret Heckler was a Republican from Baltimore. But we worked with them to create a mission, a focus, a structure, public relations materials, all kinds of things to reach out to the field. And I'll tell you, they had lots of ideas. They had more ideas than we had.
And so what were the ideas, or what were your ideas?
Everyone's ideas were to try to create in each state organizations of women who could then sponsor, support, educate women who wanted to run for office, for political office, or to parallel to that, work with them on women's issues that were coming up in the Congress. And there were course, some issues coming up in the Congress at that point. And so we tried to get them to lobby their members of Congress, most of whom were men, raise money for their members of Congress if they were women. But our major goal was to get women elected to office, and then to try to refocus some of the agenda in the Congress onto women's issues.
What kind of women's issues?
Health issues, educational issues, abortion, which was part of a health issue, and then issues having to do with helping women learn how to run for office and to get involved in the political process. I mean, most women had never done that. There were some that had. Each state had women who'd been in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and they had worked for male candidates. So they knew about running. They knew about the political process. They had never thought of themselves as running often. Mm-hmm. And they didn't even know how to recruit people initially, many of them. There were some who did. We had some fantastic, wonderful women who were involved from every state. And it was, our main focus was getting the women out, educating them so that they could run in the next elections. And we were going election by election by election at that point. Well, we also focused a lot on the Democratic and Republican conventions, which were coming up very quickly after that meeting. And we got a fair number of women elected to delegate positions in both the Democratic and Republican Party, more in the Democratic Party, but some in the Republican Party as well. And we helped to create some task forces within those parties, among those women, to try to push for women's issues on platforms and so forth. I mean, we were working without a script, and we were taking advantage of every opportunity that came by. If an opportunity came up, we thought, well, what can we do with that? And we would immediately start to focus on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm interested in the fact that it was bipartisan. You said
yes.
Mostly Democrat, but it was bipartisan, and that seems hard to imagine today.
These days. Well, that was a time when Tip O'Neill and the Republicans all talked to each other. That was a time when there was, within the Congress, there was conversation between Republicans and Democrats. And so it wasn't that unusual for us to be focusing on both women and men. It wasn't until later that, well, as we started working on the conventions, we needed to create these two different groups to work, one with the Republican Party, one with the Democratic Party. But we thought we'd be stronger if we had both Republicans and Democrats and were focused together.
Mm-hmm. So were there issues that, were there partisan positions on issues, or the idea was really to just get attention to women's health, women's education, or whatever?
Well, there were issues. I would have to go back and really look through the data to figure out what the issues were, but mainly they were health issues or any issue that came up in the Congress. There was always a women's perspective. Mm-hmm. And whatever came up, we would try to figure out what the women's perspective was, and we would try then to create a format for a response, or to work with the women like Bella or Shirley or Margaret Heckler to try to create a women's approach to an issue, whatever the issue was.
Can you talk about like what one of your most memorable or important experiences was?
In the first year, going down to Florida for a convention, for a Democratic convention, I think. And here we all were, 6 people or more in a room, staying overnight. And then going to the convention, we all had passes to get to the convention, so unlike now, we got them then. And I remember thinking to myself, this is terrific. I am going to do this for the rest of my life. And of course, didn't, but
You were hooked.
I was completely hooked. And then there were the women who I was working with, both the Republicans and the Democrats, were so fabulous. They were smart. They were able. Just, they were all young and ready to, not all young. I mean, some were older, many were older actually. They just had a common purpose. Each time we worked together, we had a common purpose. The Democratic Convention were trying to get things that women's issues on the platform. That hadn't been done before. I mean, in minuscule ways it had been done, but it had never been done in an organized way before. The same with the Republicans.
Now, this was the early 70s, I assume.
Yeah, it was. It was the early 70s. George McGovern.
I remember it well.
Yeah.
And did you go to the Houston meeting?
I did. I helped to organize the Houston meeting.
What was your memory of that?
The excitement of having so many women around us gathered in one place, all committed to women's issues, all committed to developing a women's agenda. And the fact that they were willing to show up and work on these things and to be engaged, it was really, it was a remarkable meeting. It was just a remarkable meeting.
How long did you stay involved with the Women's Political Caucus?
I was involved until 1978.
Okay. And what did you do after that?
In the middle of that, I was a Kennedy Fellow for 7 months, I think. And then I had the opportunity to go on a USAID trip to the Middle East. And I went to Egypt, I went to India, to Bangladesh, to Sri Lanka, to Tibet. It was a wonderful opportunity, about a couple of months. And I met with women's groups in all of those places and talked about how you organized women around feminist issues. And I remember one of my first meetings was in Egypt. And who showed up at the meeting? It was all men. There were no women there, not a woman. And so we chatted about it. And I said, well, our next meeting, we really need to engage some women in this meeting. Well, why would we do that? It was my first real sort of, I had never been to the Middle East before. I'd been to Europe, but I had never been there. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a really interesting trip if this is the way it is. Yeah. But eventually they did get some women to show up, probably all their wives, what do I know? But we had a talk about women and women in politics and how you involve, and the women were very eager and excited, and they wanted to know anything they could about me and about how the Women's Caucus was formed and what our goals were and so forth. So it was very exciting. And I had that same sense when I met with women in India, in Bangladesh, in Tibet. It was really a wonderful opportunity for me. It was a wonderful opportunity. I think for them it was a good opportunity as well, because some of them once we gathered, some of them did go out and organize groups. I had lots of materials to give out and talked a lot about how we did it. And, it's like, I did what I could in short periods of time. And, following that, I met a number of those women because they came to the US. Some of the very same women that I met with went out and actually began to work. Women from Tibet, people from a big group of women came from Bangladesh. And some of them began themselves to move into the small business development focus in Bangladesh. So I maintained relationships with many of them after having had the excitement of being involved in that. I came back, worked and at the caucus, I worked with a woman named Mildred Jeffrey, who you probably have heard about. She was kind of a mentor to all of us. And she became executive director, or she became chair of the Women's Caucus. After I was executive director, I became executive director in about 73, something like that. Doris left, went to the White House, and to the White House Fellows. And by default, we didn't have any money. So by default, Sissy Barenthal and others asked me if I would be the executive director. Not that they were going to raise money for the caucus, but somebody had to do the work. So they asked me. So I became executive director, and I was the executive director during the period of the Carter elections, and then the creation of our first Women's Appointments Coalition. That was the first time there was any kind of an organized effort to get women appointed to public office. And I think we did a pretty good job. I was the chair of the Appointments Coalition. So we kind of worked on the caucus, we worked on the campaigns, we worked on getting women appointed. We had books like this of women to nominate for every office. Mm-hmm. And we met with them and harassed them. And we went down to meet with the Carter campaign in Georgia when they were beginning to lay out the appointees. And we met for half a day with them, going through our lists of people for each office.
Wow.
And they do, and a lot of the women that we nominated actually did get elected, and some of them are still involved.
So you went beyond getting women elected to getting appointed into.
We moved to that. We decided, after I became executive director, we decided that we would actually have a plan. I mean, we had sort of had a plan, but I didn't, what do I know? We decided to have a three-pronged plan: elect women to office, push for legislation on Capitol Hill, mm-hmm. and then push for women appointments. And so it was, we had people working on each one of those things. And we had fabulous women working on advocacy. We had women working on campaigns, and we had women working on, large groups of women working on appointments and that kind of thing. I mean, at any one time, we had 50, 60, 100 people in the offices, all working on these issues at the same time. So it wasn't just, 10 or 15 people together. It was a large group of people. As you said, this movement was not run by one or two people. Mm-hmm. And it was a very exciting. It was because we had such talented people involved. Mm-hmm. So, and then I left there in 78, I believe. Could have been 77. And I became the Legislative and Political Affairs Director at the American Federation of Government Employees. My grandfather had been a union man, and I had some sense of it. The main reason that I went there was that I needed a paying job. They offered me a good enough salary for the time, and it was something I knew how to do. So I went there, and I sort of took some of the things that I knew from the Women's Caucus and brought it to the union. They had never done anything. They'd never done fundraising, political fundraising. They'd never done organized. Because it was a public employee union, they were afraid of the Hatch Act. And I did my best to try to help them raise money. We did a lot of legislative work there. And we then worked with women's organizations and other political groups to get people elected to office and so forth. On our staff at the union, we had half women and half men. It used to be all men. And it used to be one guy who went around and lobbied, and we had about, 12, 14 people, something like that. Mm-hmm. Working in we merged legislative and political affairs there and really created an operation that could do lobbying work as well as political work. Uh-huh. So I stayed involved in the caucus and stayed involved in political campaigns for a long time.
And really. Are you currently involved in activism?
I give a lot of money to everybody.
Very important.
Don't we all?
Yeah.
And when I left the union, I started a consulting firm called what is now called Kavanaugh, Hagen, Pierson, and Mintz. And I was a managing partner for quite a while. And we did a lot of work both with political organizations and nonprofit organizations. So many of the people that I had worked with in the women's movement were now back in my area, and some of them stayed good friends for many years. We worked with all kinds of women's groups, and I had my partners. One of my partners had been an activist who started NABO, the National Association of Women Business Owners, and her name is Denise Kavanaugh. She and another woman named Dottie Cook started NABO. So Denise and I, and then we had a couple of other people involved, and now a young man is the primary person, although we're on the website. I'm not working very much anymore, just doing pro bono projects mainly. And we had worked for 30 years together with consulting, doing consulting work. My graduate degree was from American University, and I, of course, worked when I was going to graduate school. And organization psychology was something, research and organization psychology was the kind of thing I worked on. And so I did that for 30 years, working for universities, working for nonprofits, working for corporations, and some government work as well. After a while, I got so tired of getting on planes and going to California or going to New York or going to Pittsburgh, places like that, that I finally thought I have to find some local work. And so I began to get a few jobs in the federal government, which I liked a lot. I had some great, a lot of women in the federal government are very active and very engaged in, they're not allowed to campaign, but that doesn't mean they don't have opinions on political issues.
Right. What would you say that your involvement in those early days, how did that affect your whole life?
I was always fairly independent, but they made it really, I became very independent. And I became very sure of my opinions on issues. I try not to be pedantic, but I do have opinions on many issues. And I feel fairly confident. I feel confident of my opinions on those issues. And I think being involved with the Women's Caucus, learning about how legislation is developed, learning how people begin to create messages around legislative issues, really helped me internally to think, well, how do I think? How do I process information? What were the lessons for me? That comes back to me all the time. And as a consultant, that was very useful. And as a consultant, I was able to quickly, even though, when you're a consultant, you walk in, you don't know anybody. Right. Or maybe you know one person. And you have a group of 50 people you're working with, an organization, a senior management team or something. And you have to quickly analyze what's happening in that organization. You have to begin to identify issues quickly, identify power structures quickly, identify things that are missing quickly. And I believe that my work in the women's movement and my work in the caucus and working with people like Doris Meissner and Bella and others, Betsy Crone, and a wonderful woman named Lael Stiegel, who died a number of years ago. I think that I developed the ability to do that. I mean, graduate school helped too, but I think my real education wasn't working.
Right. Well, it sounds like you became your mother's daughter.
I suppose I did. And in some ways, I suppose I did. Yeah. She was very pleased. She agreed with everything.
That's wonderful.
She really had her own opinions. I mean, I would consider myself a middle of the road person and independent. Now, at one point, I was a Democrat. Now I'm more of an independent. You get older, You get older and wiser. And although I am, I will work on campaigns, and I do support a lot of Democratic candidates. There are some women candidates who I think are fabulous as well. And there are some other issues that I think are economic issues that I think are very important too. When you have a retirement fund, you have to think about the economics of that too. So you learn, I think that's what I've learned. I think I've learned how to be a critical thinker.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think that another thing that I learned from being part of that, and I do think that everybody involved in the Women's Caucus had the same experience that I did, not just me, was that we started with no sense of how to create an organization, how to create a movement. We did not know. Everyone was kind of thinking, well, what do we do? How do we do this? And a lesson for me was that, just because you don't know how to do it at the beginning doesn't mean that you can't take small steps and begin to make something happen. And it's like when women are starting their campaigns to run for office. They don't quite know how to do it. And there are, you quickly can gather the information you need to begin to make your first speech, to begin to write your first policy paper. But I think that I think that the doors are not closed to women because women are smart enough to think through these things.
Wonderful.